Hi book friends, I'm Erin, and this is Erin Go Read. As a new decade begins, I wanted to look back on the past decade and look at my favorite books of that year, or the book, especially for years long past, the books that kind of stood out to me from that year. It wasn't until 2018 that I started reading kind of with the veracity that I do now. I probably was reading between 5 and 12 books a year, maybe, up until that point, particularly through a span of time when I was in college and then grad school. And so those years are represented here. A lot of, especially the earlier books on this list, very much are representative of what was going on in my life at that time. Rather than doing 2010 through 2019, since 2019 has its own video, actually 2 videos dedicated to it, instead I'm going to do the 2009 to 2018. So the book that represents 2009 for me is Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris. David Sedaris is a hilarious man. He typically writes essay collections, like biographical essay collections, which are hilarious. He has humorous essays about he and his siblings growing up in North Carolina, about he and his partner in Paris, I believe, in this book. He has many such collections. They all kind of run together in my head as far as which essay, which story comes from which book, but this one is one I particularly remember from 2009, and I consumed this via audiobook, but I was able to recently pick up a physical copy of this, and I would love to get to read it in physical form and maybe annotate as I go through it. In 2010, I was back to school. I was pursuing my bachelor's degree in speech pathology and audiology at the time, and I believe this was during Christmas break. I started The Hunger Games, and I think I read the first 2, and then the next break that came along, I read whenever the 3rd book came out, Mockingjay, I read that. I love dystopians. I love the idea for this. It actually, when I read this, it reminded me so much of a favorite of mine, Battle Royale, which if I had been doing this for earlier years, this book would have represented probably 2007 or 2008, I think. And I'm quite excited also to know that there is a prequel of this coming out soon. In 2011, my husband and I reread Harry Potter for the I don't know how many times. My husband has a traumatic brain injury, if you're not already familiar with that, and we both love reading, and so me reading to him is a great way for us to pass our time, enjoy stories together, and it's great for both of our brains. Especially for him because he has very poor short-term memory, so rereading old favorites is a really great way to kind of keep him invested and interested because he's familiar with the characters and the storyline. So what's interesting for him is that he really only remembers the first 3 or 4 books, and then definitely once you get into book 5 and beyond, he doesn't remember those stories, but he remembers the characters. Books 5 through 7 were books that he read after. Actually, book 7 came out 2 days before he was hit by a roadside bomb in Iraq. So he had not read that book yet, but because he knows so much about the characters and the overall plot line, even in books 5 through 7, he's really able to kind of be invested and still kind of know where we are in the story. 2012 is the year that I graduated with my bachelor's degree. There was very little actual reading that was going on in 2010 through 14, really, while I was in school. So these are all books that were being snuck into on small vacations or spending time with my husband. And this next book I actually read on the plane between Sacramento and San Diego, which is not a long flight. I think I probably read it there and back, on the there and back flights for a convention I was going to for speech therapy. And that is The Tale of Despereaux by Kate DiCamilo. And I believe the movie was out at this point, and that's kind of how I was aware of it. I'm pretty sure I haven't actually seen the movie for this, but it's a middle grade book. It won the Newbery Award, and I was just totally sucked into this. It takes place in a castle, and there's a girl, like a servant girl, a mouse, who is Despereaux, who loves like art and music and is obsessed with Princess P, and then Roscoe, a rat, and it's the story of the 3 of them and kind of the adventures that they end up going on. Love this book. I should reread this soon. I do not have the copy of my 2013 book. I'm pretty sure it's at my parents' house because I think I lent it to my dad to read. That is The Orphan Master's Son by Adam Johnson. I have kind of a fascination with North Korea, and this book really had me sucked into that. As much as I absolutely love this book, I'm having a hard time being able to kind of sum up the book. Mostly my memories of this book are just being fascinated by the lifestyles of the people represented in this book. There are really great scenes inside of a work camp. That's mostly what's really in my head, and how kind of hopeless that life can be. I'm going to read a bit of the description off of Goodreads to give you a better idea what this book is actually about. Park Jun-do is the haunted son of a lost mother, a singer stolen to Pyongyang, and an influential father who runs Long Tomorrows, a work camp for orphans. There the boy is given his first taste of power, picking which orphans eat first and which will be lent out for manual labor. Recognized for his loyalty and keen instincts, Jun-do comes to the attention of superiors in the state, rises in the ranks, and starts on a road from which there will be no return. Considering himself a humble citizen of the greatest nation in the world, Jun-do becomes a professional kidnapper who must navigate the shifting rules, arbitrary violence, and baffling demands of his Korean overlords in order to stay alive. Driven to the absolute limit of what any human could endure, he boldly takes on the treacherous role of rival to Kim Jong-il in order to save the woman he loves, Sun Moon, a legendary actress so pure she didn't know what starving people looked like. Reading that wants to make me reread that, so maybe I will get to that again this year. I have quite a stack here for 2014. We have The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, the first book being Aragon. My husband and I read these together, and it was absolutely wonderful. I had listened to, I believe, the first 3 on audiobook back when we were in at the Palo Alto VA, and I was traveling a lot between Sacramento, where I'm from, and the South Bay area, which was about a 2.5-hour drive. And that is where I first fell in love with these books. And then when Inheritance, the 4th book in this series, came out, the final book, I was in college, and it's a big, thick book, and I wasn't going to be able to get to it. So I started over at the beginning. I thought my husband would love these, so we read all 4 books over the course of, I don't know, maybe 6 months or something. Reading out loud, of course, takes longer. And we both absolutely loved it. So the kind of the premise for the whole story is it's like a medieval fantasy, and Aragon is a boy who is orphaned, and he is raised by his uncle and with his cousin, who kind of grows up, I guess, an older brother for him. And they are humble farmers in their humble farming village. And one day, Aragon, as a boy, I want to say he's between like 12 and 14 or something like that, comes up, discovers this amazingly beautiful stone. And this stone turns out to be a dragon egg, and it hatches into Seraphina. That's kind of where the story takes off, and there's just an epic world of adventure and good and evil, and we have elves and wraiths and all sorts of, good and evil type magical creatures, and we end up with kind of 2 parallel storylines of Aragon and kind of the magical business happening kind of at the high level of what the overall stakes for Alagasia, their world, will be. And then we have kind of the common man route with Roran, his older cousin. And even without any sort of magical ability, just his skill and his grit and his leadership, how he kind of takes the common man's route. And so we follow both Aragon and Roran through this kind of treacherous time in Alagasia, where they all just want to be able to live safely and be happy in their lives. Absolutely love it. If you love adventure, this is the series for you. Also great as an audiobook. Really, one of the only books I remember reading in 2015 was In the Unlikely Event by Judy Blume. I remember being really excited to find out that Judy Blume wrote adult fiction, and I picked this book up. So in this book, Miri, our main character, goes back to her hometown for the commemoration of this terrible event that happened when she was a kid. There were, I think in New Jersey, there were 3 plane crashes that happened like in quick succession. And then the story is told over 3 generations of family, friends, strangers whose stories were affected by those events. I found it really immersive, and it just kind of stuck with me. 2016, this is very well cemented in my head. My husband had an abdominal surgery that ended up in really terrible complications. He almost died multiple times, and we spent a ton of time in the hospital. He was in the ICU for 3 weeks at first, and then back and forth for several months in and out of the hospital. And while we were at one of the hospitals, a nurse there recommended to me a book, The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And he said that my husband and I reminded him of two characters and love in this story. And this has become one of my favorite books of all time. That was the first time I read it. It is a chunker. It is, I think, just under 1,000 pages. There are 2 more books to follow this. Reading this book started a stint of me reading 4 this size Ken Follett books in a row before I read anything else, and I absolutely loved it. At the surface, The Pillars of the Earth is a story about the building of a cathedral in 12th century England. It is about a great man, Prior Philip. It is about the builder. It is about the kind of the feudal system and how the government and religion are so closely tied at this point. The lives of the peasants, the lowly people, and how they are, how everything about their lives is so impacted by the gentry, how terrible the gentry can be, and the interweaving politics of the gentry and the clergy. And it is about getting knocked down and getting back up, and getting knocked down and getting back up and getting back up. And it's a great story of resilience and triumph and figuring out a way to make something work. Love this book. I do not have a physical copy of my 2017 favorite book. That is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. This is kind of a sci-fi reimagining of the assassination of JFK. So our main character lives in this small town. He's a teacher, and one day the owner of a diner kind of pulls him in and is like, "Hey, buddy, I need to share something with you. Go into this storage room." And he goes in there, and then all of a sudden he walks out into, it's the same place, but in 1962. I can't remember the exact date. And it's, everything is different. And it's this like portal in this storage room back to the past. And so this diner owner, due to some health issues of his own, is kind of passing the torch on this mission that he has set out on to prevent the assassination of JFK. So then we follow our main character as he goes back in the past, and he has to determine whether it really was Lee Harvey Oswald, and if it was, to stop him. And then what would happen if you were able to prevent that. I absolutely loved this book. It was so great. I listened to this on audiobook. I was training for a marathon at the time, and so I had like these lovely long runs to go on and just have this book going on. It's a very long book. I'm not sure how many pages because I don't have a physical copy of it, but I want to say it was like a 30-hour audiobook, which is really long. But great, because it's a really great story. I had to look it up because I was blanking on James Franco's name. James Franco plays Jake Epping, the main character. The series does a really good job of telling the story pretty accurately to the book. And finally, 2018, this was the year that I discovered BookTube. This was the year that I started reading absolutely voraciously, starting in like May or June, I believe, of that year. And I think I read like 70 or 80 books from, in the second half of the year. And my favorite book of that year, and one of my favorite books of all time, is Rebecca by Daphne DuMaurier. And this is the absolutely stunning Virago Modern Classics edition. Our unnamed main character is kind of the companion of this elderly lady, and they're on vacation somewhere. The old lady gets sick and has to stay to her room, and so our main character is able to just kind of wander about and enjoy her time. And she very quickly falls in love with Mr. De Winter. Mr. De Winter is recently widowed, and they quickly fall in love, get married, and go back to his home of Mandalay. When the new Mrs. De Winter arrives there, she realizes that Rebecca, the deceased first wife, is very much present in the very atmosphere, minds and the words of all of the servants, and just in the house itself. We kind of follow a mystery of what actually happened to Rebecca. The thing that stands out so much to me as I was reading this is I felt so connected to the new Mrs. De Winter as she was going through the experiences that she does. I was having like visceral reactions to the anxiety, to the tension, to the discomfort that she would have been feeling in these situations. And I am terrible at remembering the endings of books, of movies, what have you. Like, the journey is more important to me than the destination, I suppose, but this has a very memorable ending, and my absolute favorite ending of a book ever. So these are my books of the last decade. I'd love to know if you've read any of these and your thoughts on them. Thank you for watching. See you around the tubes.